We have all been led to believe that there are these nasty little bacteria and viruses out there who are constantly attacking us, and when they're successful in their efforts, we get sick. In short, we've been taught for decades, actually centuries, that germs cause disease. But as usual, when we start to deal with truth and reality, what is really going on is the exact opposite of what we've been taught. Folks, disease causes germs. Germs do not cause disease. My own years of research, study, and experimentation have clearly shown me that diseases of all kinds do not stem from germs or viruses. Disease, as we know it, is the result of toxic inputs into our biological system, things like poisons disguised as medications, vaccinations, chemical poisons in our food, air, water, radiation, x-rays, drug abuse, including smoking and alcohol, stress, and destructive emotional states, and most important, poor nutrition. I'm sure many of you out there may think I'm a little bit off my rocker at this point, but do try to suspend your judgment just for a little while as I get into this presentation. You have to understand that modern medicine studies illness, disease, and death. They study dead bodies, diseased organs, and sick people. Modern medicine does not and has never studied health. You have to get this idea in your mind very clearly from the start. As a result of this attitude, medical treatment today is symptom-driven, meaning that modern medicine tries to mask, lessen, or eliminate the symptoms of disease rather than treat the cause. Folks, our bodies are absolutely amazing, and science knows at this point next to nothing about how our bodies really work in a profound and essential way. Science has a way of naming things, and thereby believing it understands. Scientists tend to identify symptoms, create a name, and find a germ, and believe they have understood something. But this way of looking at things is totally artificial and backwards. Now, listen to what I'm going to say very carefully. Disease is the cure, ladies and gentlemen. The disease is the cure. Through toxic drugs, vaccinations, malnutrition, poor eating habits, stress, pesticides, pollution, radiation, and negative emotional states, our bodies are constantly being poisoned, and our bodies are constantly eliminating all sorts of these toxins. It is this natural process of elimination that medicine has labeled disease. From the most mild things like colds all the way up to cancer. What we call germs are organisms and pieces of viral material which are constantly present in our bodies. To claim them as a cause of the symptoms just because of their coincidental presence would indicate very poor reasoning indeed, but this is exactly what has been done. Even more, it is this state of elimination, which we call disease, which medicine calls disease, which creates environments within our bodies where germs can thrive. But these germs do not cause the disease. Germs are the garbage men of our bodies and participate in the elimination and breakdown of toxins and waste products in our bodies.
What we have just been listening to is an excerpt from a William Cooper presentation given by Alex Loglia on November 24, 1993, called The Germ Theory. I would like to talk to you about the, quote, germ theory and issues related to it. You have probably been taught that sickness is caused by germs, like bacteria or viruses, and that the only way you're going to heal yourself from those pesky little Germans is to seek after some form of remedy from the medical establishment, drugs and vaccines, as prescribed by a doctor or bought over the counter at a pharmacy. Where did this idea come from? In the 1800s, a man by the name of Louis Pasteur made popular the idea of the germ theory. Louis Pasteur was a firm believer in biogenesis, the idea that living organisms could only come from other living organisms. The typical belief of the day was that of spontaneous generation, which stated that living organisms can come from non-living matter. Pasteur noticed that in the air around us, were little tiny organisms that closely resembled the tiny organisms that could be found in putrefied meat. His conclusion was that these organisms came from the air and infected the meat, in contrast to the belief at the time that the organisms just happened to spontaneously grow from the meat itself. He was able to successfully prove them wrong using meat broth placed in various types of flasks. By using a special glass flask with a curved neck to prevent microbes from entering, he proved that spontaneous generation was a false belief. However, in the case of the germ theory of disease, Pasteur was far less successful in proving his case, even though it has now been accepted very widely in academic circles. Friends, the germ theory is still a theory. It has never been proven to be a fact. Basically, the germ theory states that most diseases begin as germs invading a body, based upon the faulty reasoning that just because germs are present in putrefying flesh or plants, that this is proof that it was the germs that caused them. This would be like saying that dirty dishes create cockroaches, when in fact if one cleans the dishes, they will be able to generally keep cockroaches away, simply because these bugs are no longer able to find the food that they need to survive and will go elsewhere to find the food they need. Please listen to this excerpt from an interview by Bob Tuskin with David Parker and Don Ressler, who co-authored a book called Why Germs Don't Make You Ill and Drugs Can't Cure You, by NOR, a research group called The Nature of Reality.
So let me go ahead and read you the question that's on the back of your book here, and we'll start with this. Why hasn't the ever-increasing expenditure on sophisticated medical technology and the plethora of, quote, new pharmaceutical products brought a corresponding improvement in the prevention of cures and diseases? In the prevention and cure of diseases. A little bit different of a read there, but that makes more sense.
Okay. Well, that's a good question, and obviously why we put it on the back of the book, because we were asking ourselves the same question. I mean, we've been around quite a long time, and we've seen both ourselves in the past and families and friends, have all sorts of serious illnesses, some of them fatal. Thinking of cancer here, and I'm sure everyone has probably either got a family member or knows someone who's had it or even died from it. And this was one of the things that puzzled us, because we look both in the UK and America, this huge expenditure on so-called medical technology, medical science, and we couldn't understand why there was these spiraling costs and supposedly spiraling investments in medical technology, but no decrease in illness and no sort of improvements in sort of curing things, particularly, as people even say, the common cold. They can't cure that, and they certainly can't cure cancer. And this puzzled us, and was one of the things that got us going to look into it. And we also found, that startlingly to us, as the more we researched it, that there's a term for deaths caused by the medical establishment, and it's called iatrogenesis, and which sort of, once people start having a special name for things, it all starts to look a little worrying. And in America, I think there's some varying figures that get put out, but there's several 100,000 people a year die in America alone just from things that have gone wrong medically. And this is not from malpractice, as we say in a book. This is just from, straightforward operations or the use and correct use of prescription drugs, and yet hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And there's a similar pattern in the UK and, in fact, all of the Western world. And this is very disturbing. And we were really surprised that there's not more made of this in the press. But as we did more research, we started to find that the unholy grip that the pharmaceutical companies have got on the media, and governments also, with their very powerful lobbying of governments around the world, that a lot of this information is suppressed. And many of your listeners may know that. I mean, it's probably a tale in itself to talk about how the media is manipulated and how this information is kept from the public. And it's only through shows like yours that the general public can start to learn the truth about what's going off in many fields, not just health.
Welcome back to the Bob Tuskin Show. Again, we're talking with Don Lester and David Parker, and we'll just go ahead and ask the question, why germs don't make you ill. David?
Yeah, sure. As I said, when we started looking firstly at viruses, and that's when we came across the HIV AIDS controversy, and as we looked at it with an open mind and saw, as we looked into the science and tried to trace back for original papers and the work done by Gallo and various other people, to cut a very, very long story short, we soon saw that there was no real science there, and that there was no virus that caused AIDS. So once we'd established that was being put forward by the medical establishment was untrue, we thought, well, okay, if they're wrong about that, what else could they be wrong about? So we started systematically to, first of all, go right back to square one and look at the germ theory itself as sort of proposed by Louis Pasteur about 150 years ago.
Why don't we review that for those that don't recall? What is his essential germ theory?
Well, basically, I mean, we must remember that Louis Pasteur was a chemist, so he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a medical man as such, he was a chemist. And in the days when he was looking at things, shall we say, they only had optical microscopes. And obviously they saw these things in the blood, which are bacteria. And whenever they looked at them, and whenever they saw sort of diseased or dying tissue or cells in the body, they saw clusters of various bacteria around them. And then they made the assumption that obviously the bacteria had caused that tissue to die. That was the basic misinterpretation. And we like to use the analogy that to do that is the same as, because you see firemen always at the scene of a house fire trying to put it out, it would be the same as someone mistakenly blaming the firemen for actually causing the fire, just because they always see them there. And this is the basic mistake that Louis Pasteur and certain others, it's certainly not everyone. There were lots of people in the medical establishment at that time who knew that Pasteur was really off target with what he was saying and expected his theory to, and it is a theory, it's still called a theory today, they expected it to just die away and disappear, but unfortunately it didn't, because people very quickly saw that there was money to be made in this, because while ever you can blame, in this case, bacterium of one sort or another to be causing a disease, then someone can sell you a medicine to kill that bacteria. And that's really how it started. But we thought, well, okay, we can see how this came about, but let's have a look in modern day times. Let's have a look if there are any scientific papers, original scientific papers, that actually conclusively prove that a specific bacterium is the specific cause of a particular disease. Simple enough question. But surprisingly to us, in fact shockingly to us, we could not find it, and we could not find anyone else who could point us to it, either in the medical establishment, who got very cagey about it if you asked them. And we soon started to realise that they didn't exist, these original papers didn't exist. It was one assumption built upon another assumption, and as you mentioned earlier, medical training just puts those assumptions forward that this bacterium or that bacterium causes this disease, but the science is not there. And as we moved on, we thought, well, okay, that's bacterium, and what about viruses? Well, of course, 150 years ago, when they only had optical microscopes, they couldn't see these things that are now called viruses because they were just too small. And about 1930, the electron microscope was invented, so then they could see these other little particles in the blood. And in the same way as with bacterium, they blamed them because whenever they saw them, they assumed that they must be the causes of these various other illnesses that they couldn't attribute to a bacterium. But again, it was the same mistake of firemen at the scene of a fire. And again, but we still looked through to try and find original scientific papers, and in exactly the same way as people have now realised what a fraud the HIV the virus causing AIDS is, it appeared exactly the same for any other disease that you'd like to mention, which is attributed to being caused by a virus. There is no original paper that categorically proves that. So the whole edifice of the medical establishment is built on this same fraud. It's just extrapolate out from the fraud of HIV equals AIDS, and it's the same fraud that goes right through for any virus you like. But of course, there's so much money invested in it now with the pharmaceutical companies that they're making literally billions in selling worthless drugs, basically, to kill something that is not alive in the first place. Because that's one of the other fascinating things about a virus is, scientifically speaking, it's not alive. For something to be classed as alive, it has to meet certain criteria, and that is that it has to be able to reproduce, it has to be able to eat, it has to be able to excrete, and it has to have a certain minimum level of DNA. Well, the things that they call viruses doesn't meet any of that criteria. So effectively, it's a particle, it's a dead thing, and yet the medical establishment would have us believe that it causes, well, all of these great plethora of diseases, which they seem to invent something new every year. And the whole thing is basically a fraud.
Now, don't assume that just because the germ theory of disease is false, that we no longer have to worry about basic sanitation, hand cleaning, and waste disposal. No, while it's true that germs do not take over in the body of people who generally practice proper sanitation and body hygiene, just remember that an overload of germs in our system is also not a good idea, unless one is prepared to endure the resulting sickness and go through a cleansing process. The Bible is very clear about how to practice basic sanitation, avoiding dead bodies, cleaning regularly after touching contaminated objects, and staying clear of blood-borne pathogens. Biblical instructions for basic sanitation can be found in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, chapter 7, verse 17, and verse 19, chapter 13, verses 2 through 6, chapter 13, verse 46, chapter 15, 2 through 13, Deuteronomy 23, 12 through 13, and many other places. These examples stand on par with modern best practices for basic hygiene and sanitation. Numbers chapter 19, for example, describes those who touch a dead body as being unclean, and they are required to endure a ritual washing process. Strangely enough, until the mid-1800s, physicians would not only ignore this basic hygienic practice, but they frequently went from autopsying dead bodies to examining or operating on live patients without even washing their hands. Once this practice changed, of course, hospital mortality rates dropped considerably. Further, the materials described in Numbers 19 include ingredients like hyssop, wool ash, and cedar, which are all excellent for cleaning the body of all impurities. So you see, while germs do not actually cause disease, the true purpose of germs are very similar to insects, such as cockroaches. They are there to cleanse away putrefying and dying matter. In the matter of humans, cleansing the body of toxins and providing proper nutrition through minerals and vitamins that we obtain through the food we eat and the water we drink is the key to long life and good health. And while germs, at least the friendly good type, are actually needed by our body to dispose of dying, putrefying flesh, we certainly do not want to force our bodies to go into a mega cleanse by taking on too much bacteria. That is why hand washing and basic sanitation is necessary, and also avoiding unclean foods and blood. Without these protocols, the results would be fever and sickness, not directly because of the germs, but from the byproduct of those germs just simply doing what they do naturally, which is attacking toxic waste dumps, that is, our bodies. The toxins which they have unlocked from within our own bodies are the toxic waste dump. And should this ever happen, the proper way to deal with this is to allow the fever to do its work, give proper amounts of liquids, and cleanse the vital organs so that it can rid the body of the toxic overload. not by adding more toxins as prescribed by an allopathic doctor. Once the healing takes place, the now dead and dying germs are flushed out of our system. The germ theory has been around for a long time, long before Pasteur made it popular, and today has formed the basis of almost all forms of allopathic medicine. But the true conflict is not a scientific one, but instead a spiritual one. The question it revolves around is simply this: is there a creator who looks after and cares for his creation? Or are we left to fend for ourselves, survival of the so-called fittest? Those who believe in evolution tend to follow the principle that disease is something that attacks us, invades us from outside, and therefore we have to poison it to death, or beat it to death, or cut it out, or step on it. Those who believe in a creator who is always looking out for his creation believe that disease is caused by our own failure to follow the laws of health that exist in nature. Instead of saying that a high temperature is bad, for example, and then seeking to suppress that fever, as modern medicine dictates, they will instead seek to increase the fever through fever baths, which, combined with proper amounts of hydration, mineral and vitamin supplements, will, in most cases, bring about the eventual healing of such cases. What few people are aware of, for example, is that our body, if it is properly hydrated, can survive temperatures of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Any temperature higher than this is evidence of lack of proper hydration. Clean water, or mineralized water, that is, not colas. Once the fever has done its work, the body will simply eliminate the dead and dying flesh, along with the germs that actually aided in the body's healing crisis. In the early 1920s, Harry Hoxsey began a medical clinic in Illinois and started literally curing many cases of cancer. He was later forced out of Illinois and then came to Dallas, Texas in 1936 to set up his clinics there. He was met with great success there also, but that success came with great resistance from local and state health officials. Just to let you know that healing is possible, even in severe cases of cancer, here is an excerpt from the documentary called Hoxsey: How Healing Becomes a Crime.
A non-toxic herbal tonic, a nutritional program, an attitudinal approach to healing. Harmless though it seems, this treatment ignited one of the most bitter controversies in medical history. It started a cancer war between organized medicine and one man, founder Harry Hoxsey. The trouble began with what seemed like good news.
And we now have in our files and our records many, many thousands of case histories and records, pathological proof, X-ray photographic studies that we do positively cure cancer, both internal and external, and we now have records proving that the cure stands up for many, many years, as far back as over 20 years here in Texas.
I think, my God, he's telling me the biggest lies I ever heard. This couldn't be right. And I'd listen to this for a few days, and finally I'd pick out the biggest one I thought he'd told me. And I'd go check. And when I got checking, it was right. The man hadn't lied about it at all. And finally I realized he didn't have to lie. He was telling the truth, but it was the wildest stories I'd ever heard in my life when it came to medicine.
He had this great skill as a salesman. Clearly, however, he had no belief that this treatment was useful. He was a great liar.
You know, it takes lots of nerve to put up a big, nice place in a big city like Dallas and hold yourself out as being able to furnish medicines that'll cure cancer. It takes nerve to do that. I don't believe a man that knew he was lying about it could do it.
He was doing his thing, and he had no business doing it. In fact, Hoxsey met both the legal and the dictionary definition of a quack. One who pretends to medical skill which he does not possess.
It was easy for the medical profession to paint Hoxsey as a quack. He fit the image perfectly.
This book entitled You Don't Have to Die, is filled with dynamite. In fact, it should have been printed on asbestos paper. I give you names, times, dates, names of doctors, names of institutions.
The doctors labeled Hoxsey the worst cancer quack of the century. But Hoxsey's supporters called him an effective healer, persecuted by a medical trust.
But up to now, they have never proven that this treatment don't cure cancer.
The ex-coal miner with an 8th grade education became a legend in his own time. According to the Hoxsey legend, the remedies were discovered by his great-grandfather experimenting on a sick horse. Hoxsey said his father was the first to try the medicines on people. He gave young Harry the formulas with a deathbed wish to make the treatment available to people whether or not they could pay. He insisted it carry the Hoxsey name. Prophetically, he warned the boy against the high priests of medicine who would fight him jealously. It didn't take long. Hoxsey started his first clinic in Illinois in 1924, and he immediately incurred the wrath of organized medicine. He was arrested more times than any other man in medical history. Yet by the 1950s, the Hoxsey Clinic of Dallas, Texas was the largest privately owned cancer center in the world. Hoxsey clinics reached through 17 states. Endorsing the treatment were senators, judges, and even some doctors. 2 federal courts upheld its therapeutic value. If the treatment was worthless, how did it gain so much support? To claim a cure for cancer is to invite evaluation. While the medical profession turned its back on Hoxsey, numerous individuals did make personal investigations. These experiences repeatedly turned skeptics into believers.
I wish to begin this broadcast by reading for you what I regard as a very important statement, and I quote, Judge W.L. Thornton, this is the second jury of 12 men that has found in my court that the Hoxsey treatment cures cancer. 10 doctors found that the number of cures reaches into the thousands. Former United States Senator Thomas studied a large number of cures. I had made my own investigation, had satisfied myself that cancer was really being cured by the Hoxsey method.
Hoxsey sued Dr. Fishbein and the Hearst newspaper empire for libel and slander. He didn't seem to stand a chance. The nation's most notorious quack faced a who's who of American medicine. Surprisingly, Harry Hoxsey became the first man ever to win a judgment against Dr. Fishbein and the AMA. The leader of medicine's quack attack was increasingly on the defensive. Critics charged the AMA with being a doctors' union setting medical policy in its own interests. 2 federal courts agreed it was a monopoly. Dr. Fishbein had to resign from his post at the AMA. But the Hoxsey-Fishbein trials held an even more shocking revelation. Dr. Fishbein admitted in court that Hoxsey's supposedly brutal pastes actually did cure external cancers. Actually, the conflict of medical opinion between Hoxsey and the doctors is a competition between 2 old medical traditions. In the 1800s, society sanctioned both approaches to healing. Patients had a choice of using either doctors, called allopaths, or natural healers, called empirics or homeopaths. The 2 groups waged a bitter philosophical debate. The allopathic doctors called their approach heroic medicine. They believed the physician must aggressively drive disease from the body. They based their practice on what they considered scientific theory. The allopaths used 3 main techniques. They bled the body to drain out the bad humors. They gave huge doses of toxic minerals like mercury and lead to displace the original disease. They also used surgery, but it was a brutal procedure before anesthesia and infection control. Few patients were willing to have surgery. Most patients feared allopathic methods altogether. Satirists of the day remarked that with allopathic treatment, the patient died of the cure. Competing with the doctors were the empiric healers. Contrary to the doctors, they believed in stimulating the body's own defenses to heal itself. Instead of poisonous minerals, they used vegetable products and non-toxic substances in small quantities. They especially favored herbs, learned from Native American and old European traditions. The empirics said they based their remedies not on theory, but on observation and experience.
And it's not just the media, David and Don. It's also the FDA here, a rogue government, quasi-government agency that goes with their guns and squashes and quashes people with actual cures and tells people, no, you can't talk about that, or you can talk about that. And there's complete conflict of interest because the pharmaceutical industrial complex is intermingled amongst the FDA and so on and so forth, and the media. You bring a quote here up in your book by Dr. Richard Moore, and this is a great one. He says, a lot of the problem is about money, power, and control. A medical industrial complex has succeeded in inculcating a pro-drug ideology in medical education and thus practice, and the government has gone along. There is an unholy alliance between the medical schools, the drug companies, and the politicians, a golden triangle that keeps this dysfunctional system going and prevents the American people from having the health they deserve. That's pretty well put, huh, Don?
Yes, it is. It's extremely well put and brings in what you were saying about the FDA. I mean, all these agencies are connected together. I mean, the American Medical Association, all the medical associations, including in Britain as well, they have a complete clamp on what is allowed to be talked about. And as you were saying, anything else that's called a cure, even if it's something that's a natural kind of just a natural herb even. Nobody else is allowed to use the word cure, only the so-called medical establishment. And unfortunately, there is nothing in their pharmaceutical suitcase that actually ever cures any disease. I mean, they almost admit it, they don't have cures. They suppress symptoms, and unfortunately, when you start suppressing symptoms, you're creating a situation where those symptoms just go deeper and deeper into the body, and then the toxins have to come out at some later stage, and they usually create more serious symptoms. And
right.
Continually suppressing symptoms isn't making people healthy, and this is just so different from everything that's put out by the mainstream media. I mean, the other thing, of course, is not just the drugs, but vaccinations as well. I mean, they're just going to town on vaccinations for absolutely everything. One of the latest is a vaccination for basically for sickness, for babies being sick. There's a vaccination. Apparently, it's something else caused by a virus. And as we were saying, our research shows that viruses aren't the cause of disease, which is, why we titled the book, Why Germs Don't Make You Ill. It's quite amazing.
They're going to have a vaccine for a ingrown toenail before we know it. I mean, it's getting crazier and crazier.
Yes, I mean, almost anything and everything. Yes, you're right. I mean, they're looking for vaccinations for things that just don't make any sense. I mean, what illnesses actually are. I mean, any baby that's sick, or even any human that's sick, whether it's a baby or an adult, the sickness is because the body's expelling something, and so to stop that's a natural process, and to stop that is really quite worrying, because it just, as I said, puts whatever's going on deeper and deeper and makes people more ill.